So John's senior partner at BCG, and you guys have been doing some really interesting work for the last couple of years with the World Economic Forum, and I think they have a sort of network of other companies and NGOs and stuff that you've been working with on the question of what's needed to support the creation of economic and social value using big data, and how you ensure adequate protection from consumers doing this. Now, this is a massive issue from the industry. We've touched on it in various places today. In the report, you talk about sort of the current approach to data protection and the problems with it. What are the biggest challenges that companies have to grapple with?
Well, a lot of today's conversation, the example of the Tesla, I wish I had one actually, but particularly now that they're putting a network of supercharged stations so that I can drive here from New York. But there's a tremendous amount of energy and effort around the whole data engine side, collecting, managing, securing data. We heard a tremendous amount of interesting ideas. Tesla's one about what you can do if you get access to all of that data. But what isn't getting the kind of attention it needs is the set of activities, internal and transparently with consumers, that companies need to engage in order to ensure that they actually have the ability to use that data. And I can poke my own fun at who's writing what laws and how it's different in Europe, and all of the things we'll be able to do in the United States. It'll be very much harder for you in the UK as a result of the way the European legislation is evolving. But at the end of the day, everyone is going to have, every company and organization that uses data is going to have to engage with consumers in some way, shape, or form to ensure that they have the rights to do that. And there are people who will do that superbly, and there are organizations who won't, and that's what people are not necessarily putting enough energy, effort, and attention against.
Yeah, exactly. To me, as a journalist covering this area, barely a day goes by without some headline of a data breach or a sort of violation of trust. And I'm sort of slightly surprised that there hasn't been a much, much bigger backlash yet, but it seems to be building. And isn't there a real tension between exploiting the sort of the benefits of big data for competitive advantage and protecting people's privacy in a meaningful way?
So actually, let me make the counter argument. Organizations that actually do the kinds of things we'll talk about in a few minutes to steward usage in companies' data will actually have greater abilities to create value than the companies that don't. And I think we would sum it up in the following phrase: trust is a competitive weapon. And those organizations, corporate, government, or whatever, that effectively manage trust and steward data around usages in ways that are effective, will actually perform fundamentally better than those that don't. And the positioning of it as an either or, I protect your data or I do all this cool stuff, is actually the antiposit positioning of what the real thing is.
Let me turn that back on you and play devil's advocate for a moment, because Eric Schmidt was on stage here and he sort of had this thing. He's like, oh, it's all the young companies, the new ones. They're the bad guys. They violate people's rights. We are responsible and are careful with data, etc. You could make the counter argument. There is a point where companies that get mature, they're trying to strive for more and more growth. They find themselves in a position where they are pushed by shareholders, by the market, to actually sort of drive earnings. Great, we're going to have to exploit this data in ways that we probably could afford not to do when we were growing fast.
Yeah. Well, so first of all, I would never publicly disagree with Eric and poke fun at the notion that Google would ever possibly be in a position that they would, for example, be sued by 35 different states for mid-level people doing things that were not necessarily
and about every country in Europe for various other things. Yes.
So I think the characterization of small startups do whatever they want and large organizations is just not factually true.
Okay.
That being said, I think the counter argument here is the following. If you trust me as an organization to only use the data that I have in the context of uses that you're comfortable with, and not other ones unless I come back to you in some way, shape, or form. Opt in, opt out, we can all have the menu of what the permissioning process is. But if you trust me to only use the data in that fashion, then you are much more likely to grant me the right to use it than if you don't. By the way, we did some research in Europe. There's a 10-to-1 difference in consumers' trust of different industries, and another 10-to-1 companies within an industry. And while there is all of this wonderful trust barometer stuff from a company called Edelman that demonstrates that the tech industry is the most trusted industry, in the context of this issue of trusting industries to use data and steward it in the ways they say, the tech industry is at the bottom of that 10-to-1. And I'm not 100% certain, nor would I publicly forecast where some of the leading players are within the industry, the 10-to-1 basis. So the point is, if I have your trust, when I come to do something new, if you're comfortable with that, you're more likely to say yes to me than you are to competitor X over there who has violated your trust multiple times. So I will be able to create tremendously more value, even if I have less data and poorer analytics than the other company does.
Right, got it. And so how do I develop that reputation? What are the key steps that you see there?
There are two parallel things that need to happen, and they need to happen interactively and side by side. The first is internal, and the second is external. Internally, companies need to establish a sort of a philosophy and a policy that's clearly understood, accepted by the C-suite, and moved downward, and is not written by the legal staff, and is not written by the public policy staff, but is a business set of decisions about under what circumstances, not how I'm going to use it, but how I'm going to ask for its use, and when I get the use, how I'm going to steward it. They then need to take that and embed it in actual processes, metrics, and ways of ensuring that they're complying. And that's part of what some of the other conversations were during the day about transformation, because that is a transformation activity.
Right.
So that's path one. Parallel path number two is they then need to be transparent with consumers. Consumers need to see that these are the policies, these are how they're being managed, and then they need to be transparent about where they make mistakes and not, so that consumers come to see how they're doing it and trust that if something goes wrong, they'll see it, so that they actually come to understand.
So let me take both of those tracks. So on number one, being transparent with consumers, absolutely, I think that's great. Being clear what data is being collected and how it's being used. But as we move to new platforms, and I'm thinking particularly of mobile, already when you're on the web, on a desktop, you're looking at 5 pages of privacy policies. And if you can actually make sense of what they say, good luck. On a mobile phone, it's really difficult to get everything down there. So are we going to actually be in a position where it's much harder for us to actually understand
So you're talking about the permissioning process versus what I'm talking about, which is the policy and communication and transparency.
Right.
So I have all sorts of ways to let you know. Let's say I'm a cellco. I have all sorts of ways to let you know, not the details of every item I collect, and not the details of every possible sub-way I might use it. Because, by the way, one of the fallacies of the consumer should control all of this is if you projected how much time it would take consumers to actually manage all of the controls that people want to put in place, no one would actually be able to use their cell phones. They'd be too busy managing their data compliance rights. So the point is, if you know that I will use your information for marketing purposes internally, but I will not, unless I ask you, use it, sell it to third parties. And I'm clear about that, and you know how I'm measuring myself, that's fine. That's a high-level set of things. And when we were doing this work, you can put the things that matter to consumers, maybe not on a mobile phone screen, but you can put it on a web page. That's different than the 46-page, 80-page legal documents. It's the human document that's not what you need to legally sign because of all the policies, but what consumers need to understand. So transparency is about something very different than, which is why the internal path I'm talking about can't be developed by lawyers and policy people. They're human issues and human dynamics around things that are not too hard to understand.
Okay, and then on the second thing, you say and companies need to be open when they make mistakes and when something goes wrong. I mean, my experience has been it's like, oops, we did that? Well, we had no idea that this was going on. We had no idea this person was driving around a car with a program that sniffed Wi-Fi. We had no idea. It's hard to sort of trust.
Well, here's the point, but it goes back and forth. I need to not only have a policy, I need to have protocols and measurement procedures and metrics so that I discover that one of my employees, here's the difference, right? If one of my employees goes rogue, behaves outside of policies that I've established, and I discover it, and I A, report it, and B, fire the person because they were behaving off the reservation.
Right.
That's a very different dynamic than, oh, for the last 2 years, somebody has been doing the following. We discovered it from a third party, and we're going to wait to be sued. Those are two fundamentally different human dynamics.
Yeah, I love Twitter and Google. They have their transparency reports where they say, this is what governments asked us. I mean, I would actually love to see these companies have transparency reports. They say, actually once a year we'll admit here's all the things that we did wrong in the collection of data. But we're not there yet. But maybe we'll get there.
Well, and then the last point before we go to questions is this debate has been too focused, not our conversation, but all of it on Twitter and Facebook and Yahoo and Google and YouTube. This is actually about all the data that's out there, right? And if Target can let a father accidentally know that his 14-year-old daughter is in her second trimester of pregnancy because of the coupon they drop, this is far beyond this question of, gee, what can you pull out of the digital world?
Got it. Can we bring the lights up and we can see if there are any questions for John on this subject? There's one here at the back.
So, given how important identity is to everything we've heard about big data today, do you ultimately see identity federation being something that's controlled by governments?
Well, I certainly think that some governments have definitely stated their intention to try and do it. I think that actually when you look at the legislation they're putting together, it's hard to see how it turns into practically executable law, and law that doesn't get litigated almost as soon as it's in place, because most of the attempts to do this focus on the data and they don't focus on the usage. And so you take the Tesla example. The issue isn't whether or not the tires are losing air. The issue is whether it's a benign use to let the person know that they should fill their tires, or whether or not there's some perverse use that if, for example, that Tesla sells the information about the car's location and leads to theft. I mean, I'm making it up, but a better example is healthcare. My medical identity is a great thing for providers to have to be able to figure out preventative care, but in some societies, it's not a great thing for insurance companies to see if they can use it to deny me health care. So the problem with almost all of these digital identity data-focused systems from a legislative perspective is they miss the whole notion of context. And as Craig Mundy was saying in our World Economic Forum work, it's the use case or it's the context, stupid, it's not the data. And that's what's wrong-headed about some of the ways some different geographies are going about it.
It was a great question, thank you. Another question over here.
I'm going to touch on the Tesla example again. I come from the AEC industry, architecture, engineering, construction. And, we have as an architecture firm, we have a fundamental responsibility for health, safety, and welfare, et cetera, et cetera. I wonder if you've seen any kind of ethical responsibility so as with Tesla as an example, could they know something about a car, and if that person has an accident, they should have known to tell that person, and they didn't, they could be negligent.
It's a great reason, and that's why the license agreements on the web are like 247 pages, because this is a very murky area of responsibility. And it's a two-part thing, because one is, if they did know, could they be sued for not letting me know that my tires were getting dangerously flat, so I was in at risk of a blowout which would create an accident. And secondly, the reverse part of that is, who has the right to really know that? And maybe I don't actually want the help, and maybe I don't actually want to take advantage of all of the cool stuff that Tesla has in terms of the nature of their car. I just want to drive it, and I want to figure out how far it is to the next supercharged station, because maybe the adrenaline rush I get of maybe I'm going to run out of electricity 10 miles away and have a,
Elon Musk says that never happens.
$150,000 immovable object of art is something that I like. But there's this huge issue looming about individual choice versus corporate responsibility that I don't believe anyone has really started to attack, and it's almost a second order question around what is the engagement process around who gets to have what rights to do what. I mean, today it works for the Tesla because the people who buy that car are by and large of a population that has a certain attitude towards data collection and usage and views that as all benign. But there is a very large part of the population that might like that automobile that would feel completely different. And that's part of the complexity here.
Time for one more question. So we'll take it from this side.
So you talked a little bit about the context of legislation, and I know you said not so much in social media, but in those cases where, corporations or organizations are trying to provide individuals with as much information as they can about how data will be used. But when the data is put into a public space, so even if I were very careful about what information I revealed about myself, someone who knows me might be revealing other information. So what is the recourse individuals would have to see and understand and maybe refute data about them that exists?
Well, that's actually one of the real problems with the data regulation structured frameworks. Because it essentially starts from a mindset that says all data is collected or volunteered versus data is inferred. And the two-part problems are there's a tremendous amount of data that's collected that you have no sense of or participation in and is not in the exchange of services. I mean, your picture so far today has probably been captured 14 or 15 times, and captured by people with whom you have no relationship with because you walk through places and did other things. So as a consequence, there's a whole bunch of information out there that is about you that you have nothing, you have no connection to in any way, shape, or form, problem one. And problem two is data that's benign in one context when combined with another piece of data creates individually identifiable and dangerous data.
Right.
So again, I think the answer to your question is, I would argue, the focus of legislation, and again, I'm not a policy person, I spend my time working with companies, helping them expand their trust footprint and figure out how to be more effective in this world. But if you step into the policy world, I think the issue has to do with norms and enforcement, not specific rules around specific data sets, so that if behavior defined badly occurs, there are enforcement mechanisms, and the system needs a much greater degree of flexibility and possibility for innovation and change than some of these fairly structured, here is the data and here's where I'm going, would imply.
I think the other answer is choose your friends wisely and make sure they don't say anything about you that you really wouldn't want to be said.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please would you thank John Rose?
Thank you very much.
Terrific.
Pleasure.